What is Alzheimer's?
So Alzheimer's disease is a type of dementia. So dementia itself is not actually a disease, it's a set of symptoms.
So essentially, that's what is happening during Alzheimer's.
Yep.
Like your neurons are just breaking down pretty
Your
much, or your neurons are dying.
They are interfering with communication because the way that your neurons talk to each other is through these synapses. Like you have a neuron here and here, and the axon is going to go right up to the cell body of the other neuron, and they're going to talk to each other.
If you were to say what you just said, try to reverse it when you're 10 years into diabetes, like that's not how it works, man. Like you've been damaging your brain for the past like 10 years.
Yeah.
So.
When you are having conversations with people, when you're talking to people, you are making more connections to like you're strengthening your neuronal pathways.
What is Alzheimer's?
So Alzheimer's disease is a type of dementia. So dementia itself is not actually a disease, it's a set of symptoms. So it's characterized by cognitive decline, behavioral decline, all these things that you associate with, someone that has dementia. There's a couple different types of diseases that are in this dementia umbrella. So Alzheimer's is the most common one, the most prevalent one. It's about 50 to 75% of all cases of dementia is Alzheimer's disease. So the thing that separates Alzheimer's disease from other diseases or other things that are in that dementia umbrella are the specific proteins that are specific to Alzheimer's disease and not something else, even though it will behaviorally look the same as perhaps other types of dementia. So these proteins that specifically mean it's Alzheimer's and not something else is going to be something called amyloid beta, and then tau, or neurofibrillary tangles is another thing that this tau protein is called. So both of these proteins do exist in your brain normally. However, when kind of things go a little haywire, they'll start becoming a more diseased state. So with the tau, for instance, it'll get hyperphosphorylated. So basically you have this protein already, but when your brain messes up and you start getting phosphate groups added to this protein, then it becomes characteristic of the Alzheimer's.
Or how do you say that again?
So hyperphosphorylated tau, basically. So what it is, it's this tau protein that you would normally have in your brain.
Right.
But these phosphate groups will attach onto the tau. And when a bunch of phosphates attach to this tau protein, then it becomes a tau tangle.
Oh,
yes.
Okay, perfect. And that's interesting. A lot of people just know Alzheimer's just as a disease. So you're saying that the dementia it's dementia first, and then it trickles down to like Alzheimer's. What are the other ones?
So Lewy body is one of them.
Lewy body, yep.
There's a couple. Even I believe that certain types of traumatic brain injury could even be considered in that dementia umbrella.
CTE?
I don't know all of them off the top of my head.
Yeah.
I'm not going to lie. But basically anything, dementia is more a set of symptoms. So anything that presents as this cognitive decline, behavioral decline, social decline can be characterized as dementia. And it can be a multitude of actual diseases that you could have that are presenting as this subset of behaviors.
Interesting. Yeah. So would you say if someone did, or you identified someone with dementia, in your world, would you suggest it to be Alzheimer's? I know it's not like you're not gonna diagnose it, obviously, just 100% just by looking, but is it like between you and your colleagues, is it assumed that it's, since you said it was 50% to, what is it, 70%?
50 to 75, yeah, it 75, is pretty high. It's kind of hard to say assumed because science is so rigorous. However, kind of tricky. So previously, in the last maybe up until a couple years ago, it was impossible to actually confirm a diagnosis for Alzheimer's until after death, because you basically have to cut open their brain and see, okay, do they have the amyloid beta? Do they have these tau tangles? And so it could be assumed that it was Alzheimer's, but we really didn't know until posthumously. However, in the last couple years, science has really closed that gap a lot. So now you can do brain scans that will check for amyloid beta data. They're very expensive and they're not very accessible to a lot of people, which is unfortunately why it's not more common for elderly people to get them done. But if you were really curious, it is an option that we now have. And then something that I think that we're going to see a lot of happening in the next 5, maybe 10 years, maybe even sooner, is a lot of blood biomarker runs. So right now, it's kind of on the forefront of science is being able to test for biomarkers in the blood. So up until very recently, this has not been an option to check for Alzheimer's disease. However, it's starting to become a little more common. We have the machines and the technology available to do it. We also have the knowledge available to look for some of these proteins in the blood that might be indicative of Alzheimer's in the brain.
Is that how you initially kind of see symptoms of Alzheimer's, by checking their blood?
I would say no. That would be something that you would do probably quite a bit into seeing the symptoms. I would say the first thing is that the people around you are going to start to notice cognitive decline, behavioral decline, forgetfulness. And then also you can start to see like aggression sometimes, especially in males actually. Alzheimer's often presents with this type of like aggressive behavior as the disease state sets in. I think the forgetfulness is probably the biggest one.
Do you know who it affects more, women or men?
Yeah, so it affects women much more than men, actually. So about 66% of cases are women. 1 in every 6 women will develop Alzheimer's disease, and then 1 in every 11 men. So there's quite a big discrepancy between genders.
Interesting.
Yes.
Is it, would you say it's hormonal? What's the leading cause of that? Why is it women?
So where science is at right now, we know what Alzheimer's is. There is a ton of unknowns about the risk factors, the whys. There's a lot unknown there. So there's actually not a ton of research in this area. There's speculation, of course. So something that we do know is that estrogen is a neuroprotectant. The age that women tend to go through menopause would be like early 50s, and Alzheimer's tends to present late onset anyway, which would be the most common type, is going to be in like 60s, about 65. And so we can speculate that due to the amount of time that women have been in menopause, that their estrogen has been dropping that whole time. And that could have a negative effect on the brain and might be a reason that Alzheimer's is more common in women. But it's hard to say because the age is also a factor. And so it's hard to pinpoint if it's menopause. And there is just so much research lacking in this area.
Yeah.
The lab that I'm in does actually have a branch where we look at links between menopause and Alzheimer's. But something that I run into with that is everything with science is always cross-referencing. It's looking at what have other people done. It's looking at other research articles. What's the data? What's there? And what I've noticed is specifically with menopause and just women in general, there's like no research in this area, which is so interesting because obviously
very fascinating.
Every woman is going to go through menopause and there's so little research on it. Yeah. And so I think that there's a huge need right in that area.
For both men and women, what age around do they start getting Alzheimer's, would you say? Because my mom, just for a quick note, she got it around 55 years old when she was working at UMC, and UMC, University Medical Center here in Vegas. They pretty much take care of their own. They're all a bunch of Filipino nurses, but they started noticing that she'd be doing administrative work. She was an RN supervisor over there, and she would not know where she was at almost. And this was early.
Yes.
It hit her really aggressively in the beginning, and they started to notice that. So she was making her rounds, and I was a kid, but I overheard my mom and dad talking, and they were talking about how I believe she took a break or either got suspended because she actually mixed up the charts and they didn't know what was going on, right? They were just kind of like, okay, well, it was just a mistake. They're getting older, whatever. But yeah, so as things progressed, they started to notice that she just kind of days off, and that's when they knew. Yeah.
I would say that is earlier usually than it would present, which, to touch on that a little bit, there are, I guess you could say, 2 types of Alzheimer's. So they have the same proteins, like I just said. They're both going to present the same with the cognitive decline, the amyloid beta plaques, the tau tangles. However, there's early onset, which is the familial or the genetic type of Alzheimer's. This is a very, very, very low percent of cases. So this is going to be 3 to 5% of people that have Alzheimer's disease have a genetic or familial component to it. And that would maybe possibly, without me knowing, possibly what your mom had. I don't know. Or the more common is going to be late onset Alzheimer's disease. It's usually like referred to as LOAD, late onset Alzheimer's disease, and also like sporadic. So this is going to be, you don't have any genetic component. There's no familial component to this. This is just going to be a result of lifestyle and like if you were a smoker, if you have diabetes, all of these are risk factors.
Diets.
Yeah, so many different things. But that's going to be late onset. I would say that tends to present about 60 to 65. I don't think 55 is unheard of. It's maybe a little bit on the earlier side of that. But something that's really interesting too about the way that Alzheimer's disease works is that you might start seeing those behavioral and cognitive declines in like 50s and 60s, but you're going to start seeing the buildup of those proteins, the amyloid beta and the tau, 20, sometimes even 30 years earlier than that, but you'll have no idea because you don't have any behavioral decline yet. Yeah. So if you look at a graph of, like age and time and whatnot, someone that starts presenting Alzheimer's like symptoms, 55, 60, they have probably been developing these proteins in their brain since probably very early 30s, maybe even late 20s, depending on the person or case by case. But so it's hard to say when it develops because I guess technically the answer would be 30s sometimes, but you're not going to see that disease state until later. And just because you have amyloid beta and you have tau tangles, that's not enough to say that you have Alzheimer's disease. Right. You can't diagnose it as Alzheimer's unless the person has that behavioral decline, unless they have dementia. So someone could die and you could cut them open and look at their brain and maybe their brain, is like filled with A beta, which sometimes we see this. People will have a lot of A beta in their brain, but they never presented as having Alzheimer's disease. Yeah. And this is another place where we're not really sure like why that is or why some people are possibly not presenting this behavioral decline. But you have to have the dementia state in order to say that you have Alzheimer's disease, as well as those two proteins in your brain.
And you're saying those proteins, just to go back to it so people understand, are the main causes when they start going haywire in the brain? Or when they start really building up in the brain?
I would say when they start building up, yes. So once there is a certain level of buildup, that's going to be, which, again, takes 20 years when you have enough buildup for it to actually be behaviorally problematic. That's when, you'll be able to say like, oh, okay, this is probably Alzheimer's. So there's a protein called APP. It's called amyloid precursor protein. So this is the protein that you have. I know earlier I said, well, oh, you have these proteins. Well, so you have the precursor protein.
Yeah, it's a specific one before.
So yes. Sure. So it sits in this membrane in your neurons, and there is another protein that comes in and it cleaves this. So when it cleaves it, normally this piece will break off and your brain just degrades it. It's not bad. It doesn't form a plaque. Your brain just gets rid of it. It comes in, it's cleaving at the proper place. So the normal cleavage, there's these enzymes, and one is called alpha secretase and one is called gamma secretase. So those are going to cleave at the areas that are normal. Your brain's just going to get rid of it, break it down. We're good to go. However, what can happen is there's this other enzyme that comes in. It's called beta secretase. And so you'll have the SNP with the beta secretase and the gamma. So you don't have the alpha working, you just have the beta. When the beta secretase cleaves this protein, it cleaves it in a different area. And this piece that breaks off, your brain can't break it down. It's referred to as being sticky. So what happens is you have this beta secretase cleaving all these amyloid precursor proteins, and you have these pieces that are coming out of the membrane, and they're sticky, so they're sticking to each other, and your brain can't break it down because the cleaving point was the wrong point. So rather than having like a protein that's like this, you have something like this, and now they're all sticking to each other and they're forming these plaques outside of your cells. So they are interfering with communication because the way that your neurons talk to each other is through these synapses. Like you have a neuron here and here, and the axon is going to go right up to the cell body of the other neuron, and they're going to talk to each other. But when a plaque forms in that area, suddenly you've cut communication. So the other protein, tau. So tau is going to be a protein that's found inside your neurons. So the A beta is an extracellular component of Alzheimer's, and then the tau is an intercellular component.
What do you mean by like intercellular?
So imagine like in your brain, you have all your neurons, right? So the amyloid beta is going to exist in the spaces between the neurons, and then the tau is going to be inside the neurons.
Oh, okay. And okay.
Yeah.
I see what you're saying.
So that's really the only like difference between well, I guess there's a ton of differences between the two, but that's the main difference. One is extracellular and one is inside the neuron. So with the tau being inside the neuron, the way tau works is it's on microtubules, which think about you have proteins and they need to travel down your neuron, right? And so tau, you're in a parking garage and you need to go and there's this piece that opens, one car goes in and then it closes. So that's what tau does. It is attached, and every time a motor protein comes along the axon, it's gonna open, it's gonna let the motor protein through, and then it's gonna close. And it does this open, close, open, close, open, close thing. So in a disease state, what happens is you have phosphates that are gonna come in and they're gonna attach to this tau protein. And when all these phosphates start attaching, it becomes hyperphosphorylated. And what happens is it breaks off the microtubule. So once it breaks off, it is going to kind of similar to the A beta with the stickiness. This is now like a piece of a tangle. So almost imagine it like a hairball or something. So you have this little tau tangle, and then this is happening in other areas. So all these hyperphosphorylated tau pieces are breaking off and they're tangling together. And then what's happening is because they are involved in the structural integrity of this microtubule, now it's going to degrade. And now you have axon death, neuronal death, because these structural proteins that are normally keeping it together. So this breaks off and now your tubule just like it falls apart without the tau.
So essentially that's what is happening during Alzheimer's.
Yep.
Like your neurons are just breaking down pretty
Your
much, or your neurons are dying.
So the tau is killing your neurons and the amyloid beta is preventing your neurons from talking to each other. And then a third component, this is not specific just to Alzheimer's because you see this in so many things, but it is a core pathology of Alzheimer's, is neuroinflammation. So your brain will be inflamed.
And that's mostly due to like your lifestyle, pre-lifestyle or before you start aging. And I know genetics is involved, right? Or your family heritage.
I would say more often than not, in 95 to 97% of cases, it's going to be lifestyle. There is maybe a small genetic component. Maybe you are more likely to have certain cytokines that are pro-inflammatory, but that's so few and far between that I would say it's almost always, when it comes to neuroinflammation, lifestyle and diet is huge. Yeah.
Do you know anything about I personally don't, but the Chris Hemsworth one, how he found out about, did you hear about that?
I didn't.
How
no.
he found out that he was susceptible to like dementia. And then he took a break from acting. I didn't look too much into this.
Is there any chance you remember if the protein ApoE was mentioned? It's spelled APOE, but it's usually pronounced ApoE. ApoE4, does that sound familiar?
No, it was so long ago.
Yeah.
I figured I'd take a shot and ask you just because.
I feel like it might be this ApoE. So this is not the familial genetic component I was talking about earlier. So if you are in that like 3 to 5% of Alzheimer's cases that has this genetic component, no matter what, you are going to get Alzheimer's. There's nothing you can do to prevent it.
Oh, wow.
But it's not, let me specify, it's not 3 to 5% of all people. It's 3 to 5% of Alzheimer's cases. So
right.
So I guess of the general population, it's much smaller than that. But 3 to 5% of cases are genetic in the sense like you have this gene, you are going to get it. So this ApoE gene, however, it's not you're for sure going to get this. It's a risk factor gene. So it increases your risk of getting Alzheimer's depending on the allele that you have. So ApoE4 increases your risk of getting Alzheimer's disease. Yeah. So if you have it, you're at higher risk, but that doesn't mean you're definitely going to get it. You can have ApoE4 and you could still not develop Alzheimer's. However, it's something that if you did have it would be a great reason to start really, really, really looking at your lifestyle at a young age, at your late 20s, early 30s. And this is a much more accessible test that's not super expensive. So to do a panel or ask your doctor like, hey, can you do a genetic testing for ApoE? That's something that I would say is attainable for most people if you're curious. So there's 3 different types you could have. There's ApoE2, ApoE3, and ApoE4. And you get one from each parent. So you're going to have 2 of each. ApoE3 is like your baseline normal, no added or decreased risk. If you have ApoE2, you're actually less at risk for Alzheimer's disease. If you have 1 copy of ApoE4, you are 4 times more likely to get Alzheimer's. And if you have 2 copies of ApoE4, you are 15 times more likely to get Alzheimer's. And this number is even greater in women. So something to think about. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very, very fascinating. So if I were to go into your lab knowing that my mom had Alzheimer's, what would you test for first? Like, how would you say at my age right now, I'm a 39-year-old male, and I just wanted to just take precautions.
Yes.
Who would you actually, this is a better question, who would you suggest I go to first? Not necessarily maybe like a neuroscientist, but maybe who would I see? Like a neurologist, or would I?
So actually, no. Considering that you feel totally normal, you feel healthy, you're not noticing any cognitive decline, I would say in that very just early stages of, I'm just curious, I would go to a primary care doctor and I'd be like, hey, I'm just curious. I would mention, like someone, my mother or someone in my family had Alzheimer's. I'm very curious if I have any risk genes. Can we like test for them? Then they will maybe send you to a genetic counselor is usually what they're called. Or they might be able to, depending on the doctor, order the panel there. And I would say that visiting with a neuroscientist or neurologist is quite a few steps away from, hey, I'm just curious. I want to know if I have these genes.
Right. I could imagine that's when you're like deep into it, right?
Probably.
That's when you're like, all right, shit's going down.
Yeah. And at that point, you'd probably be pretty unaware. It'd probably be the people around you that are like, hey,
exactly.
we're going to the doctor.
Right. It's like, why? What's your background? I know that you told me that you're going to school for your PhD in neuroscience.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you tell me the process of it, for the audience,
Sure.
what you're specialized in, why you decided to go?
Yeah, just definitely. So my bachelor's degree is in just straight biology. I also have a minor in mathematics. And during my undergrad, I knew I wanted to go to graduate school. I knew I wanted to get a PhD. And so I started doing research pretty early into my undergraduate career. I did research in a couple different labs. I spent most of my time actually in a microbiology lab. I worked for the water district, or I interned for the water district. And I loved research. But with microbiology, there wasn't enough thrill in it, I guess, or I wasn't fascinated enough to do it forever. It was a wonderful experience for an undergraduate internship. I really learned what it's like to be in a lab, to work in a lab, how a lab runs. And I would say that experience is invaluable. But to have a little more direction after I got my bachelor's degree and thinking, okay, like what do I really want to specialize in? I'm sitting there and thinking, I don't just want to think about what can I do for the next couple of years that I get the next degree. Like, what do I want to do forever? And neuroscience it really just clicked. And I was very fascinated by it. With graduate school, you're obviously signing up for a pretty intense and rigorous program. So I'm thinking I can't do something that I don't absolutely love, or it's going to be rough, Yep. But to do something you're passionate about is really going to make life better for everyone during that experience. And so I kind of landed on neuroscience after considering. It was between that and genetics I was also very fascinated with. But neuroscience, something just clicked. It just felt right. And so something that is unique about graduate school, it's a lot different than undergrad. So I guess also just to specify, when I say undergrad, I'm talking about getting your bachelor's. When I say graduate, I'm in a PhD program. So that's what I'm talking about for that. So with undergrad, you're taking a lot of classes, that's everything you're doing. You get your degree. I think sometimes people think graduate school is maybe like, oh, you're just taking harder classes, but it's actually not what it looks like at all. My class load is very, very minimal. I take 1 to 2 classes a semester. They are high level classes, sure, and they're very specific to like neuroscience for me anyway. They're very discussion based, but my day to day is actually not very class heavy or work heavy in like a classroom type of sense. So graduate school is really you're working in a lab. There's a professor that you find. This is referred to as your PI, your principal investigator. So this is going to be the guy that runs the lab, the girl that runs the lab. This is their lab. You're working under them. And so with neuroscience, there's going to be a bunch of different labs where all of these PIs are all in this neuroscience umbrella, but they're all running different labs. They're all doing different research, So my experience was basically just looking at, typing in like neuroscience PhD and then looking at all the different professors that had different labs and being like, okay, what's spiking my interest? And so the lab that I found that really, really clicked for me was a lab studying Alzheimer's disease. So not everyone that's getting a PhD in neuroscience is going to know about Alzheimer's disease, just as I don't really know that much about something like schizophrenia or PTSD, whereas other people that are in labs specific to that are going to be experts on it. So getting your PhD, it really is like, it's not necessarily me becoming an expert in neuroscience, because neuroscience actually is pretty broad. It's me becoming an expert in Alzheimer's disease. I'm going to know a lot about neuroscience, but it's this very focused mainline one thing. So the lab that I'm in pretty much strictly does and studies Alzheimer's disease. So I don't have, thankfully I don't have anyone in my family or like a personal connection to the disease. I can't really tell you why I had like an inclination to this lab, but something about just like reading the research and it just clicked. I just knew, I knew in my heart, I knew in my brain that it just worked for me. So I started off just to make sure, like volunteering in the lab for a little bit. And I pretty much immediately knew, I'm like, this is it. This is a good fit for me. Applied to PhD program with that professor, with that lab, and working on, I'm in my second year with that program now.
Yeah. It's crazy how that happens, huh? It's kind of like, I don't know what clicks to be able to find, I guess, your quote unquote passion.
Yeah.
You just kind of go through school and then you just find it somehow, because I think a lot of people think about, they theory craft their way into trying to find it. But then I think you just got to kind of do it.
For me, it was very much like an elimination process. Like rather than from the get-go knowing, oh, I love this, it was more so I dabbled in this a little bit and it's like, okay, well, it's not that, let me close that door. And as I get further and further, I take this class, I take that class, I took an ecology class. I'm like, okay, I don't want to be an ecologist. I took a virology class. I'm like, okay, it's not that. And as you get like closer and closer, you'll start coming like more in line. So I guess to talk about like my day-to-day a little more as like a grad student, to most it would look a lot more like just like a scientist job. Like, I'm going into a lab and I'm doing 40, 50, 60 hour like work week in this lab actively doing research. And so what I'm learning, while I'm learning a little bit from classes, it's not mainly where I'm learning from being in this lab setting and working with doctors, working with scientists, going to conferences, and really learning from experts in this field and actively carrying out this research, which is so cool.
Yeah, the hands-on.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the only way you learn.
Absolutely.
That is very, very cool. That seems very that is high level. I think
it's very specific though. So it's like, I just have to put so much focus on this one thing.
Yeah. And that's why I don't think you could study all of it, right? Like schizophrenia, PTSD, dude, I think I would pull my whatever hair I
could
have
spend
left.
my whole life studying Alzheimer's and not know everything about it. Yeah,
right. That's so fascinating. So back to it. You know what fascinated me about our conversation in the coffee shop was social connections.
Yes.
And before we get into it, social connections, what I started figuring out as of just recently, is so huge.
Oh,
Not even just for Alzheimer's, for depression. And I'm sure they're all interconnected somehow. But yeah, it's just mood levels change.
Yeah.
It's good for your health. It's just back in the old days, we're part of a tribe and we have to socialize. And we just need people. So specifically for dementia, Alzheimer's, so on and so forth, can you talk a little bit about the benefits and how it could prevent Alzheimer's, dementia?
Yeah, absolutely. As you said, like a lot of people talk about like, oh yeah, social interaction is good for your brain. And it's like, okay, well, why? So yeah, it makes you feel good, but I like to look at things like mechanistically, like what's happening in your brain? Why is social interaction good for you? And there really is so much behind this. So basically the way like your neurons work is that as they fired together, you're making these synapses, you're making these memories, you're making these connections. So where your memories sit is actually going to be, it's like between two neurons. So it's this space where neurons have like these little processes, and then where they're meeting, there's all these synapses where all these memories are. And so with social interaction and talking to people, and I'll get into in a little bit why having in-person social interaction is so much more important than any other type. But to start off, when you are having conversations with people, when you're talking to people, you are making more connections to, like, you're strengthening your neuronal pathways. And so I like to tell this example or kind of explain it like in this little story, because I think it really helps put in perspective like what's happening in your brain. So let's say, and why it's so important to like talk to people and talk about things and talk about memories and talk about experiences. Okay, so this metaphor analogy I like to use is like, okay, so let's say I'm here right now and I'm going to work, wherever you work, right? So I don't have a GPS, I don't have a map, and I just need to get there, based off of how I know how to get there. So let's say for me, okay, I'm going to UNLV, right? So I know, okay, well, normally I take the 215 and, I'm going to get off here. So let's say that road is closed. And again, I don't have access to, a map or something. Yep. So I'm like, okay, well, this is closed, but I can get there on Tropicana. Okay, so I get there on Tropicana. Okay, Tropicana's closed. Okay, well, I can get there on Flamingo. Okay, well, Flamingo's closed. Okay, I can get there on Maryland. So let's say Maryland's open. Okay, I can still get to UNLV. I can still get to where I'm going. So memories kind of work a very similar way. So let's say you are let's say you have a buildup of these proteins, this A beta and this tau. So let's say you have like a memory, right? And it's attached to this neuron. So let's say this neuron is in network with 10 other neurons. It's all hypothetical, because your neurons are in connection with like thousands. But okay, this neuron is connected to 10 other neurons. And it's similar to this like roadblock story. So even if this neuron, this neuron, this neuron, and this neuron are blocked from this neuron, so in this case, dead, or there's a plaque there, or the tau has, degraded the neuron, I haven't lost that memory as long as I can get to it from this other connection.
Okay, so it's like a different road.
Yes,
to get to.
exactly.
Yeah.
It's a different road to get to the same memory. And the more you revisit memories and the more you talk to people, you are strengthening and building that neuronal network and those memories. And so let's say, you only talked about something like one time, you only have one path to that memory per se. If there's a roadblock there's only one way to get there. Yeah, if that's gone, that memory is gone. But if you have 50 different ways to get to that memory, then you're going to be able to preserve it for a lot longer, even if you're starting to see cognitive decline or someone is starting to develop dementia. As you socialize more, you are literally strengthening the pathways in your brain. And you could, I don't want to use the word prevent, but you could delay the onset of a disease state for probably years.
Really?
Yes.
That's how much impact it has.
Yes, because think if you're isolating, you're not talking, you're not building those new connections. So if you only have, like a couple ways to get to each thing in your brain, like let's just say the only way I know how to get to UNLV is I go down Tropicana. It's the only way I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if that road is blocked, I'm not getting there.
Yeah,
period.
And then you're just going back.
Yeah, I'm never going to reach that mememory. And so, once the memory is gone, like it's gone. There's no way to rebuild it.
So is it kind of like, say, your analogy of going to Flamingo and, Maryland Parkway, you could take that way.
Yeah.
I guess you're working your muscle memory a little bit. Is that kind of how it works? It's kind of like, okay, you're strengthening it, like going to the gym, or not really?
A little bit.
Kind of how I picture that for some reason.
Like you are making like more connections. And so, yeah, you are strengthening your brain. I think that's a good way to put it. The same way that social interaction is really good for your brain, like brain games are really good for your brain. Things like chess, like, yeah, you're right. Yeah. You are strengthening.
Sudoku or something.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
your brain muscles are not
Right.
muscles, but I mean, that is essentially what you're doing. And so just to touch on, I know I mentioned it earlier very briefly, how like in-person interaction is very important. So when you're talking to someone face to face, you say something, I immediately say something. There is no delay. So your brain is actually working faster because there really isn't like a delay or processing time. You have to like think on your feet. You have to answer on your feet. It's not really something that we're consciously doing. I think most people, can communicate pretty easily without, feeling like you're really like exercising your brain.
Yeah.
But with something like texting or social media, you might think you're immediately replying. Let's say, you're like, oh, well, I'm texting back fast. The fact that you're not in this position where you have to immediately say something, like your brain actually does have a lag period to you're going to write something. It's actually not working as hard.
Okay.
So in-person social interaction and talking to people and asking, like just telling stories about, like your life and like revisiting memories is a great way to make more connections and network your neurons together.
Interesting. That's funny that you were saying that about social media. I was like, wait a minute, something good comes out of it? I kind of like, wait a minute, we're doom scrolling over here and it's helping my memory. I'm like, all right.
I would say no.
Yeah,
I would say no.
Right, yeah.
For the most part.
Yeah, so you're saying that, like, as of right now, since we're talking, since we're just kind of responding to each other, it's working out those
Yes.
quote unquote muscles, or how I put it.
Yeah.
Wow. All right. Perfect. Can you talk about the nutritional aspects on how to prevent Alzheimer's? What is the best kinds of diets, and also the diabetes part of it? Because I know that's a huge part.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess to start with the diabetes or the lifestyle factors, as far as like preventing goes, we can definitely like try our best, but there's still a lot of research to be done in this area that to close those gaps. But things that we know are risk factors for Alzheimer's, like smoking is a big one. A high fat diet is also a big one, but diabetes is a huge one. And so many Americans have diabetes as well as being pre-diabetic, even like people that are a lot younger. I think it's something really important to talk about because it is just such a huge risk factor. And I personally think that the largest or the biggest like preventative thing that you could do would be to make sure that your blood sugar is in check and to try to not get diabetes, because that'll be really good for your brain if you don't get it. So there is a huge number of people with Alzheimer's disease that have diabetes, and it is one of the largest risk factors for developing Alzheimer's disease. If you end up having the lifestyle one, like the sporadic one, diabetes is a huge one. So aging is obviously a big risk factor, and smoking and diabetes are huge. So with diabetes specifically, you have a protective layer around your brain. It's called a blood-brain barrier. And this is going to prevent stuff from getting in your brain that's not supposed to get in your brain. But something that happens when you have diabetes is basically when your blood sugar is raised, you're in a hyperglycemic state, right? So you have a lot of sugar running through your blood that shouldn't be. And when this happens, it actually makes your blood-brain barrier permeable. So when your blood-brain barrier becomes a little more permeable, stuff starts getting in that shouldn't be in your brain. So you have this one type of cell in your brain. It's actually an immune cell. So these are your microglia. So microglia are not neurons, but they are a very common cell in your brain. And they're basically like the cleanup cells in your brain. They're the only immune cells in your brain, and they're going to phagocytose is what it's called, or basically eat stuff that's not supposed to be there. So when stuff gets in your brain that shouldn't be in there and your microglia become activated, this signals more microglia to become activated. And then when you have this kind of repetitive cycle of this increased activation of microglia, you're going to start having the production of cytokines that can be like pro-inflammatory. And this is going to increase the inflammation in your brain, which inflammation is, I feel like, the root of everything.
Yeah.
Pretty much. Yeah, you could argue. And so once you have that increased neuroinflammation, you're just putting your brain in like such a bad, for lack of a better
like a
word,
stress
state. Yeah.
And you said 80% of people that have dementia or Alzheimer's?
So I believe the statistic is 80% of people with Alzheimer's disease have diabetes. So it
Wow.
is, it's a huge risk factor. And it's so important to be on top of it too, because let's say you're talking to like your parent or a loved one, they're a little bit older. And I don't know if this is the case for anyone, but they're like, oh, don't worry, I'll get it in check. Something that is unfortunate about a diabetic state is that you don't really have a lot of rescue once you've been in a diabetic state. So let's say you have diabetes. Let's say you've had it for like 5-10 years. I don't know. And then you're like, okay, well now it's getting really bad. Okay, let me get it under control and then everything's going to be okay. Well, for the last 5-10 years that your blood-brain barrier has been permeable, you've already caused that neuroinflammation. So as much as you can bring your blood sugar down in the future, a lot of damage has already actually been done to your brain, unfortunately.
So there's no turning back from that damage.
I don't want to say there's no turning back because obviously, like getting it in check at some point is better than not.
Yeah.
But I would say it's definitely something to not put off and to be very aware of and just keep your sugar in check and try to never let yourself get to that point where you are hyperglycemic and you're having, like, you're basically getting brain damage, like in a kind of subtle way. But you're getting brain damage.
Yeah, it's almost that guy I was telling you about, Max Luverne, he was saying that it's almost as if they're trying to find medications, but it's almost as if they think if they take like the certain medications, the analogy was, he said, if you take off the stones in a grave, then the dead's going to come back alive. Meaning, if you were to say what you just said, try to reverse it when you're 10 years into diabetes, like that's not how it works, man. Like you've been damaging your brain for the past like 10 years.
Yeah. So. And I think that when people think about diabetes, like more often than not, the first thing that you're thinking about is probably not your brain. Like you're thinking about your body, you're thinking about your blood sugar.
That's
you're probably thinking that like your fingers hurt and are tingly.
And inflamed.
But you're probably not immediately thinking about your brain. Like you're possibly thinking about your pancreas because that's where insulin is made. Maybe you're thinking about your liver. I would say for the average person, brain is probably one of the lower things they're thinking about if you just got diagnosed with diabetes. And it's so unfortunate because it's one of the main organs being, affected. And it can just have, like we said, like such a negative impact, even if you do end up like reversing it at a later point or getting it under control. The best preventative measure, I would say, is to, just not let yourself get there. And if you do have like a loved one that I would say is, a little bit older and they are either pre-diabetic or diabetic, to definitely like have a conversation with them about the importance of urgency in getting it under control sooner rather than later.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about what kind of diets are good for Alzheimer's dementia? Again, I was listening to that podcast with Max, and he was saying that at least for him, he recommended like a ketogenic diet, but I know every individual is different and everyone has, their own thoughts on it.
Yes.
What, from your experience and, with the labs that you do and just everyone that you've talked to around your environment, what would you say is, I guess, in your opinion, the best diet?
So specifically for your brain, when it comes to like brain health, like your brain diet, if you will, I would say that the Mediterranean diet is the best diet. Not that other diets aren't good or great for certain things, certain ailments. Like I think for inflammation, like keto is really good. And I'm not bashing one diet or another. I could get into why I think long-term keto would be questionably sustainable with other things. It's like, as much as it's doing good in this area, I could see how it could have a negative effect in other areas. Not to get into like the science too much, but it can lower your blood pH, which can have negative effects long term. So specifically for brain health, I would say that the Mediterranean diet is so great. Sorry, just because I'm thinking about it now, I think something to touch on with keto and why it is probably so good for a lot of people is because if you're doing keto, you're basically not eating any glucose, so you're taking away that diabetic risk. You're lowering like the risk of hyperglycemia. Which I'm sure is like, if you're diabetic, like going on a keto diet might be a really good, like, hey, let's like nip this in the bud right now.
Right.
For a younger person or someone that is generally healthy-ish or just curious, like what's like a long-term, like a diet I can eat for the rest of my life that's going to be really good, I would say as far as brain health goes, I would say, yeah, the Mediterranean diet. So to touch on that a little bit, antioxidants are found in like a lot of food in the Mediterranean diet, like certain berries and whatnot, and like nuts even. And antioxidants are great for you. And there's just, the Mediterranean diet is so nutrient dense. So, like salmon, fish, nuts, olive oil. So another huge thing is like omega-3s. So omega-3s, like you're going to have it in olive oil, you're going to have it in salmon. And there is a lot of, omega-3s, they have a protective effect of the blood vessels in your brain. They can also lower neuroinflammation. And then they can also, so damage that has been done from oxidative stress, omega-3s can actually help like repair and reduce that damage a little bit.
What do you mean by oxidative stress? Just chronic stress that you think about on a daily, or is
actually no. So oxidative stress, I'm trying to think of the way to explain it that'll make sense. So there's something called like a reactive oxygen species. It's basically the result of eating poorly and then like the leftover like molecules that are kind of like from chemical reactions, you have byproducts, right, that are bad. So when you have like this process of oxidation, it's like the process of losing electrons. So you're just like changing the chemical composition a little bit of a molecule that's then making it reactive, meaning it's going to bind with like other things that maybe it shouldn't. And so antioxidants are great because what they do is they bind with these like reactive oxygen species or molecules that are not supposed to be there. And it's like a way to get rid of them or remove them from your body so that they're not doing damage. Think about it. I think a good analogy would be like, imagine like a nail rusting.
Okay.
That's kind of like what's happening inside your body a little bit with oxidative stress. Like that's what it is. Omega-3s and like foods high in like antioxidants can help like quell that damage.
And the obvious is stay away from ultra processed foods, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I would say that a high calorie diet with whole unprocessed foods is better than a low calorie diet with a lot of processed foods. And it's unfortunate because I think that like as a society and like culturally, we're kind of getting out of it now. But even I remember when I was younger, there was just like such a push on just like low calorie food, low fat this, low fat that, when really like the process to make those foods like that, like wheat thins, low fat, and then like, I don't know, like you read the ingredients list and it's like 50 things and it's really like, it's not good for you. And so I think if like we can move away from like this calorie equals bad, and it's like, that's not really the case. Like olive oil is very high in calories and it's very good for you. Avocado, salmon, like these foods are high in calories and they're very good for you. And even if like you look at the people that predominantly eat these foods, like they're not really overweight people. I mean, think about people in, Greece, in basically anywhere in Europe that they eat a lot of bread, they eat a lot of olive oil, Italy, and they're not unhealthy. I don't know if you're familiar with like blue zones, but it's a couple places in the world where there's a lot of people that live to be over 100.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
So
is India one of them because of turmeric?
No.
I don't. Yeah.
But like I know Loma Linda is one of them. Okinawa is one of them, and then I believe Sardinia is one of them. And
really?
Like, they eat bread, they eat pasta, they eat olive oil.
Yeah.
And I remember watching a documentary and like this old guy is talking about it, and he's like making lunch, he's making a salad, and I mean this guy poured like half a cup of olive oil in his salad. He just things that we would look at and be like, oh my gosh, that's 1,000 calories just in olive oil. But when you're just eating like this whole foods and non-processed foods, like I feel like your body kind of just like takes care of it. It regulates. And the Mediterranean diet's really great. And something if I know salmon is expensive, and if it's not super attainable to regularly have that diet, I would suggest possibly incorporating like an omega-3 like pill into your daily regimen. It could definitely be really good for you.
When people try to get healthy, they usually go from one extreme to another.
Right.
I think the ones that are a little bit uninformed, they'll kind of go chicken breast, asparagus, no oil, no seasoning.
Right.
What would you maybe suggest into someone starting to try to prevent diabetes from getting Alzheimer's
Right.
and all that, like to start
Yeah.
off. I mean, obviously probably cut the ultra processed fried foods, but what else would you suggest?
Yeah. So actually, just to touch on something you just said, because I feel like it's like really common with like you're like, oh, cut out the fried foods. While for general health, that's great. That actually really has, I would say, no impact on diabetes, which I hear people say that a lot. They're like, oh, well, I shouldn't eat fried foods. And it's like, well, really, like the diabetes is going to be from carbs, starch, sugar, like, you know. So with frying something, yes, it's unhealthy. And if you're frying something, it's probably breaded. So you're getting like
Yeah,
some carbs from
sure.
that. But even things that are very like fatty, for their own reasons, they are unhealthy. And high fat diets are also not good when it comes to like Alzheimer's disease and whatnot, and the processed foods. But I wouldn't specifically link that to diabetes. So I would say, as far as like processed foods and whatnot, anything, I don't want to say anything, because going, like you said, like from one extreme to another, it's really not sustainable. You might eat really healthy for a week, maybe a month, but to eat like that forever, especially if you're like not, you know, incorporating things that you enjoy, it's not super sustainable. But I would say if you could be mindful of, if you're craving something sweet, sweeten with honey rather than, you know, like high fructose corn syrup. Even just using true cane sugar is going to be a lot better than eating things with like high fructose corn syrup. And just kind of be aware of that. And then also maybe sometimes people forget that complex carbs do also break down into like starch and sugars.
Glucose, yeah.
So something that you might think is, you know, like pretty healthy, like oatmeal or like, I don't know, whole wheat bread. Yeah, I mean, I would say they're generally like kind of healthy, but if you're high risk or if you are pre-diabetic, I would stay away from super starchy foods.
Yep.
And if you're
Like
really
even something like
trying-
white rice. That's probably just personally
a
for
little
me,
bit,
but
yeah. I mean,
I love
a
my
little
rice.
bit,
Amazing.
yeah. It's
Yeah.
just something to kind of, not that you have to like remove it, but just be mindful of.
Yeah.
And
Everything in moderation, right?
yeah, I would say if you're really trying to cut your sugar and you're having really intense cravings, fruit and honey, I think will really help with satiating the craving without you, you know, feeling like you're going crazy and you're going to eat an entire like cheesecake that night or something. Dark chocolate, I think, is also like really good.
Yeah.
You're going to get a little bit of that sweet like craving satiated without totally spiking like your glycemic index.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
And so moving on, since we've covered social connections, diet, we'll just couple. Another big one that seems to stand out is exercise.
Yeah.
What would that, as far as your brain, be doing? Is that kind of related to like the social connections where you're just like kind of firing off and working that muscle, or does it work different?
I would say it works a little different. Exercise is also really, really, really good for brain health. A lot of it is just like circulation. And as you're working out, I mean, your brain is basically making happy chemicals. Like you're getting endorphins. You're helping with circulation. You're gonna be breaking down, like if you do have free glucose in your blood or like glycogen buildup in your liver, like as you're working out, you're kind of like, you know, hacking away at like your stash of stored up like sugars and whatnot. And so it can help with that. And I know that there's a ton of like mechanistic, you know, reasons why exercise is so good. I don't really know them. Like going to be like, oh, well, when your heart rate spikes, you know, it does this to your brain. I'm not familiar with exactly what it does, but I know that to just like I know that exercise is very good for brain health. But I guess I couldn't tell you exactly why and what is happening. I just know it to be true.
Yeah, a couple of things. I mean, I think we covered a great amount. I know Alzheimer's is this big that correlates to like pretty much everything what you were saying about the proteins. It took a while for me to get like kind of the grasp of that. But just a couple things like number one, I can't even believe Alzheimer's is real. Like looking at it from my mom's perspective, and she lived here. It was almost like a dream. It was almost like a movie where like an alien took over her brain. Like that's what I mean, that I can't believe it's real. It's like just observing her for the past 3 years, which at first, when I first moved to San Diego and came here because it got really bad, she was still saying, she'd say, I mean, she was already pretty much gone, but she was saying that, she'd smile all the time. She'd say, I love you, right? And she could still go to the bathroom by herself.
Yeah.
Like she knew the way to the bathroom. It was just, I was like, okay, cool. And then it just went from 0 to 100. She obviously went to the bathroom or on, the floors, and not to get too visual, but I was just thinking to myself, wow, this is a crazy, crazy like disease.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of with the progression and how it works and whatnot. So Alzheimer's starts, like the pathology and that protein buildup, it begins in your hippocampus, in your brain. And that's the region involved in like learning and memory. And that's why to begin with, it's going to result as like forgetfulness. But as it moves throughout your brain, then it's going to start affecting like motor, coordination and like other things. And like when it does get really bad, what's happening is, so your hippocampus is like kind of in like the middle of your brain, like if I were to poke at the roof of my mouth, it's kind of right there. And as it's moving forward, like, and as the disease is like progressing and it's moving towards like your cortex, that's going to be when it starts getting really, really, really bad, because it's no longer localized to just like your learning and memory area. And you do see just like such like a health decline. Like a lot of the time people like forget how to swallow even. And it gets really bad at the end, unfortunately, as it starts like moving.
Yeah, definitely. And just to add on to that, that was one of them. We needed to start feeding her. She couldn't, at first she could eat, like she'd look at the food, just stare at it for a while. We'd put it down. That was our method, right? We wanted her to kind of do everything. And we're not doctors, like we're not neurologists. So we just did what we thought was the best for her, because we were always around her. And we just lay out the food there. Obviously like low sugar diet or sometimes not at all. And she would just walk up to it and look at it. And then, she'd take bites and bites. But again, it got progressively overly worse over time. And we started having to feed her. And then sometimes we'd give her these medication. I don't know the exact one, but it kind of like just regulates her and calms her down, because like you said, they'll tend to get aggressive.
Yes.
And when you're trying to put on like pants on her, and even when we took her to get blood work for her diabetes, and to the neurologist, we literally almost had to hold her down, which was almost an impossible task, even for a 80-pound woman at that time. Yeah. So what you were saying about that really, it really kind of hit me, because that's the same way I visualized it. How you say people with Alzheimer's tend to be more aggressive. Right? Yeah.
It's a really, really, really sad disease. I'm really hoping that as like research continues, I do think a lot of, progress is being made. There's actually just a new drug that came out that seems to be like pretty promising. And I think that as we start having more of like these screenings available, like the blood biomarker thing I was talking about, and as we're able to maybe catch things earlier, more knowledge, more everything about it. Like I would like to think that within the next 10 years, we'll have a pretty good handle on it. Whereas up until probably this last year, there has been just not a lot of progress made in, like, we're so far away from a cure, but I think that we are really close to being able to hit it early and like prevent, or at least like really, really, really slow down further progression. The hard thing with once it is already set in is that kind of like going back to memories a little bit and whatnot. So first off, neurons can't regrow once they're dead, but also memories. It's kind of interesting how memories like exist. So like I mentioned earlier, between two neurons, there's like a synapse. It's like this little like chemical bridge, and your memory like lives in that. So if you lose that neuron and that memory like goes away essentially, even if some crazy drug or crazy treatment comes out, you can regrow neurons somehow. I don't know. Even growing a new neuron in that area wouldn't be attached, like it wouldn't regrow that memory with it. And so once a memory is gone, it is truly gone. So I don't know if there will ever be a cure in the sense of like being able to go back from a progressed disease state. But I think that we are definitely approaching a point where as soon as you start to notice that cognitive decline, that you will be able to very much so prevent or slow down progression. And maybe with the cure, it would be something that if you could catch it before you have the cognitive decline, that you could, like prevent someone from ever getting it. So I really, really, really hope that we see that in hopefully the next 5 to 10 years. Science and medical advancement is really just like crazy, you know,
Oh, man. Yeah.
like just exponential, like we just see so much stuff. So
Absolutely.
I think the outlook of the future of treatment is positive.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think that's just with technology in
Yeah.
general, where AI and all this is going. But yeah, this was very, very informative, and I appreciate your time. Thank you for coming. I
Yeah.
learned a lot about it, and yeah, again, this I really wanted to talk to you because obviously my mom and
Right.
yeah, it's very related, and yeah, I learned a lot today. Thank you
Great.
so much for coming.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for
Awesome.
having me.